I scarcely know where to begin today with Peter, but time to say a very good morning. Peter Hitchens is here. Peter, very good morning to you.
Morning.
I mean, I do kind of scarcely know where to begin because while there are many who say, oh, it's all tittle-tattle, it doesn't matter about the Prime Minister's bedroom habits, it doesn't matter about his wallpaper, it doesn't matter what furniture he buys. Well, I'm afraid it does matter because I'm beginning to wonder, as I know you've been saying for quite some time, just how much of a buffoon Boris is.
Well, it matters very little to me what sort of sofa he sits on and all the rest of it. What does matter is because when governments run out of steam or don't have any real purpose, then this sort of thing begins to take over. It's fundamentally it's personal struggles between people becoming public because that's the way they find to get revenge on each other. I'm astonished at the indiscipline of them, actually. One of the things that was one of the great successes of the Blair regime was that they managed for most of the time to squash stupid disputes of this time and stop people saying, "Oh, well, they can't even control themselves."
Yeah,
and you would have thought people would have learned from it. It's just incompetence. I don't think it has any political significance, but the country is run by and large on principles with which I disagree, by people who either have strong views which I disagree with or have adopted such views to get into office. The first lot, of course, were the Blairite Labour Party, who were, in my view, more or less Euro-communists. And then the Conservative Party, particularly after the David Cameron takeover, which, although it didn't either believe or understand much of what it adopted, decided that it would adopt Blairite positions, basically on sex, drugs, and rock and roll, to get the approval of the BBC and the media and academic establishment, and so make itself electable again, which it wasn't as long as it even had the slightest traces of conservatism left in it.
No.
That's what we have. We have basically a new Labour government composed of people who aren't actually Blairites.
And you've always been of that opinion, rather than what I would have always said, which was they tried to sort of make out that there was very little difference between Cameron and Blair, that really there was a sort of centrist approach that they'd come towards, in which basically they wanted people to become disinterested in politics because they didn't appear to have any firm convictions about anything. But I know you famously said that actually what was going on beneath the waterline was much more interesting.
Well, yes, it's the classic swan, isn't it, which glides along the surface while its feet are paddling frantically underneath, and certainly New Labour was full of people who were paddling frantically underneath for very, very serious objectives. Peter Hyman, once one of Blair's closest aides, came out with this and pointed out that in his view, as one of them, they were far more radical, for instance, than Jeremy Corbyn, far more revolutionary. And I had an old friend who died recently, Philip Bassett, who told me much the same thing when he went off to work for them and abandoned journalism. And it seemed to me to be pretty obvious looking at them that so many of the leading characters in New Labour were, in fact, people who had been, like me, Marxist revolutionaries in the 60s and 70s, but had not, like me, renounced that and at any stage, and had transferred their revolutionary fervour into a much cleverer approach. And this is what people don't understand about the left. The left doesn't just take defeats and go away and say, sorry, we were beaten. When the left is defeated or thwarted or when it fails, it goes and thinks again about how to approach things. And what came about in the 60s and afterwards, and after the collapse of the Soviet experiment, was a completely new form of revolutionary Marxism, which is all about culture and sex and education and broadcasting and controlling all the areas which influence the way people behave. Indeed, you might call it behavioral psychology, if you like.
Yes.
Which brings us...
Well, I was going to say, brings us rather nicely to Ms. Michie.
Well, I don't know how to pronounce it. I think it may be Mickey, but I'll fall in with...
Well, I mean, Mickey sounds like it could be more humorous.
Doesn't it? Yeah.
I don't think she's very funny, sadly.
I don't know. I think what I loved about when I looked into her was my favourite story was that she was so hardline. She still is. She comes from that branch of British communism, which is very pro-Soviet. She was so hardline that when there was a row inside the Communist Party, when it still existed as such, she had her pram searched at his conference by her fellow comrades who were looking under the baby for hardline literature, which they feared she was smuggling in. I think a lot of people misinterpreted why I put that in. I was just trying to illustrate, first of all, how ridiculous left-wing politics
Yes.
can be,
Right.
and also how very much she was on the side of hardline, unreconstructed communism,
Right.
and it comes from what you might call communist aristocracy. Her parents were very, very highly placed in the intellectual left of the Cold War period and before that, and it all stretches back right into the 1930s. And these people are very serious about wanting to change the world.
Yeah.
I respect that. I don't. I've got no problem with people wanting to change the world as long as they're open about what they want to do, and as long as they stick to civilized methods in doing it. But the problem is, anybody who thinks that they're going to transform the world into a paradise tends to get the idea that their ideas are so good and so important that anybody who opposes them is not just wrong but bad and has to be eliminated.
And you made that point in your piece about this green revolution, because everything this week seems to be feeding into the same narrative, Peter, because I've like you, for a long time, been questioning this kind of ludicrous language that gets used. And it gets used by journalists, much to my chagrin, on the BBC and on Sky, where they talk about, well, of course, we must eat less meat. And, of course, we'll have to fly less. We'll have to get used to travelling in cars less. And I'm kind of going, sorry, when did we become the royal we, and when did you become the man that told us what we should be doing?
Well, the BBC, for a start, made a specific decision that it wasn't going to treat opponents of the Green Dogma with any courtesy or fairness anymore some time ago, and it doesn't. And it's pointless actually trying to argue about it. The Green Dogma has become, for the educated middle classes of Britain, the nearest they get to a religion. Now, I find this particularly fascinating. I've always been what would broadly be described as an environmentalist. I prefer railways to roads. I hated the destruction of the country to make way for the motor car, which took place during my childhood and early teens. I still do. I hate to see a tree cut down. I'm as green as you can be in terms of the practicalities of immediate life and any policy I can see. So I can't really be characterized as somebody who wants the oil companies to take over the world and turn everything into a vast oil field producing huge amounts of pollution and destroying the atmosphere.
Yes.
But the problem with the policies which are being embraced by the current government is that their practical effects on their own terms is non-existent. If you close down all the coal-fired power stations in Britain, which we more or less have done, while China and India are ceaselessly building new coal-fired power stations, and China has more coal-fired power stations than we have power stations. Right. Then the effect of our closing down our coal-fired power stations is very great on us, because it actually weakens our power generation system in important ways and makes us more and more dependent on foreign power. But it has absolutely no effect on the state of the atmosphere. So even if you believe the Green Dogma that the power stations are coal-fired power stations are causing global warming, then what we have done has been less than useless.
Yes,
and
exactly.
That's the point. And now the next thing, and we've run out. That was quite easy to do, because closing down coal-fired power stations doesn't, in most cases, have a huge immediate effect. And you can import nuclear electricity from France, or indeed coal-fired electricity from the Netherlands, which I believe we still do, and so you carry on having the power. But if you want to move on to the next stage and fulfill the extremely rigorous targets which the government has set itself and has legally bound itself to follow, the next thing comes is gas. And an awful lot of electricity is generated by gas, and a huge amount of home heating and home water heating is done by gas as well. And when they start having to have a go at that, then the impact on people's personal lives in cost and inconvenience is going to be very big, as it is when they start telling us that we can't eat the diet that we've had up till now.
Yeah.
But this will happen bit by bit, and people say, how on earth did we reach this? Just as people look at their power bills and say, why are they so high? And part of the reason why they're so high is that they're full of green levies, which are not very heavily publicized, but that's a very large proportion of your power bill. I forget what it is now, but it's not small.
No, it's not. No, and we're also one of the few countries that levies it as well.
I'm sorry, I talked over you there.
I'm just saying we're one of the few countries that levies it, rather like the flying bill that we get given, which is supposed to be a green tax when you fly. Hardly any other country puts that on a flight cost, but we do.
I'm not sure of the answer. Certainly, we have been from not quite a long time ago, very, very determined to implement these things. And indeed, if it is a cause as good as its supporters claim, then this would be perfectly reasonable. But if people also understood when these things were announced what they would mean for their lives, what concerns me is that people don't really understand it, and when it eventually begins to show its full effects, they'll wonder how it was they agreed to it. But there's so little debate on it. When the Green thing was originally debated in Parliament, I think 2 members of Parliament voted against the provisions which we're now living under. There's 2, I think, out of more than 600, which really doesn't make it possible to have a serious debate. And I think that anybody who has any doubts about this is more or less underrepresented in politics and most of the media.
Yes.
So one has to try to do it. But if you start arguing about the principles of it, then so you might as well build yourself a guillotine, stick your head in the hole, and let the blade go. There's no point. There's no winning to be done here. There's no debate to be had. You're just a heretic who has to be eliminated and abused.
Yes.
Even for saying, well, I've just said, I'll get that. But I'd be very careful not to say anything heretical. So, which just goes to show that even that won't help you against these people.
Well, it won't. But it's a sort of depressing thought that this process has taken over practically every aspect now of public life, of debate, of any kind. You know, the word denier is now brought in to cover COVID, to cover the environment, to cover green energy, to cover all manner of different things. If you don't believe that there are 4 million people living in poverty in Britain, you're some kind of cruel, ghastly Victorian, sort of mine owner and pit owner and wants to just drive everybody back to the way it was in the Victorian times. There's no nuance left anymore.
Well, that's correct, but I call it marshmallow totalitarianism. It is, in fact, very difficult to express dissenting opinions, and if you do, they don't spread. You can hurl it, so like hurling a stone into a pond, and there's a splash, and then the water closes over it, and nothing ever happens as a result. You're ignored, and also you're marked down for later exclusion or mockery or denunciation or misrepresentation in some way, and who knows how that will be. And this inhibits and frightens people out of getting engaged in these debates, and bit by bit we become more and more a society in which only one set of ideas is acceptable, which is, I might say, the sort of thing which revolutionary Marxists set out to do. No need for a vast KGB or a Gulag archipelago to enforce this, because the Cultural Revolution has been so successful, and because these ideas have become so dominant in the schools and in the universities and in the television studios and in many newspaper offices, there is basically nowhere where opposition can be expressed where it will actually threaten the status quo. So that's it. People like me, someone will point out, well, here you are, you have a column on a national newspaper, and here you are on a national radio station. Say, well, it's true. But once I've said this, as I say, the waters will close over it, and the places will get no more, and nothing will happen. No one will reply rationally to what I say. If actually you have a case, let's argue it.
Right.
What will happen is that somebody will abuse me and call me, as you rightly say, a denier, and that will be the end of it.
Yes. But there was a time, wasn't there, sort of middle of last year, Peter, when people started to pick up on what you've been saying to us and maybe asking you to be on the BBC again, which you said to me you hadn't done for a long time. Has that stopped again now?
I think there are still one or two. I say probably more than one or two. There are still quite a few civilized, open-minded people in the BBC. But I think the BBC as an organisation has, in the past 3 or 4 years, moved very, very sharply towards a number of positions: third wave feminism, totally intolerant greenery, COVID fanaticism and zealotry, and it also, one finds it has extraordinarily hardline positions on the sort of propaganda which might lead us to war with Syria or Russia. And it's becoming increasingly a monolithic organisation in which those who uphold its old standards of impartiality are, again, increasingly isolated. I don't say they don't exist or that I'll never get on again, but it's a noticeably narrower world in which to operate and notice. And I hear stories from people in the BBC who are reasonably friendly to me about how discussions came out about whether I should present a particular Radio 4 program from time to time. And the answer was a horrified no, without any discussion. So this happens. I know it happens,
and that itself is extraordinary, isn't it? Really, because
it ought to be, but it isn't. It's what I've learned to expect.
Yeah, because one thing that happened at the weekend, we're going to be speaking to Tonya Buxton coming up shortly, who was actually at the Freedom March. I'm not a marcher particularly. I know you used to do a bit of it back in your days of revolution. But I mean, it's incredible, is it not, that a march with as many people as were marching, and the estimates are anywhere from 20,000 on the low side to 500,000 on the other end of it. That the BBC rarely covers anything like that if it's a march about something they don't agree with.
Well, it does to some extent depend on size, but you must contrast that, of course, with the way in which the BBC gives very considerable publicity to the Alexei Navalny movement in Russia. And if they gave equivalent publicity to movements of the same size and nature in this country, then it would be interesting. But they don't. Also, the other thing is they're very uncritical of Mr. Navalny, who, if he lived in Britain, would be much disliked by Guardian readers, particularly for his unpleasant statements about the inhabitants of the Caucasus region, right, and remarks which people might look up, which put him certainly well to the right of UKIP, let's say, because of the extraordinary attitude towards Russia of what I would call our liberal elite. His offences against liberalism are overlooked because he is an opponent of the Putin regime.
Yes, and that in itself, again, is remarkable. But, I mean, you know, it seems to me, and I mean, you and I have been in journalism roughly the same amount of time, that journalism isn't even journalism anymore. You know, there are very few people who question things. There are very few people who wish to question things, and they don't seem to even want to challenge their own bosses nowadays.
Well, I don't know. I think that there have been huge changes in how many have been driven by technology, some have been driven by falling circulations. Some of them, but most of all, I think, they've been driven by the education system from which journalists emerge, in which people are, over and over again, taught what to think, but not how to think. And I still say that when I was growing up, we were still taught very much more to question things, and taught how to think and how to reason and how to doubt. And we were taught that doubt was good. To some extent, as so many things are, it's a result of the end of the Cold War. As long as the Cold War was going on, it was a fight for freedom. It was very difficult for the governments of the Western countries, which are on the side of freedom, to suppress it or discourage it in their own countries. But now that's over. That's gone, hasn't it? And the embarrassment that governments used to be made to feel when they behaved in repressive ways or intolerant ways or ways which threaten freedom, that embarrassment can no longer be visited on them because they're not on the side of freedom anymore, really, are they?
Well, you made the point in your piece, I think, on Sunday about the football debate that wasn't it remarkable how quickly that kind of pivoted around because people actually got worked up about it.
Well, I should never understand my own country. People are put under house arrest, threatened with economic ruin and wild inflation, deprived of their jobs and their businesses, and all they do is they go and have a drink in their back gardens and forget about it. But if somebody suggests that football should be commercially reorganised, the entire country rises in revolt from the royal family to the back streets of Blackburn, and the thing is overturned. These are obviously people have different priorities from me. I should learn to live with that, I suppose.
Well, I suppose so, but it does tell you, doesn't it, that when they say you can't fool all of the people all the time, maybe you can. And maybe that's what's going on. But I mean, the only thing I think that I can hold on to as we end this and grip onto with grim determination is that I still don't think the people in Downing Street know what they're doing. Therefore, if they don't know what they're doing, there's a chance that we can stop them doing whatever it is they want to do next.
Well, I don't know. Maybe they do know what they're doing and it isn't very nice. Remember, we're talking about Susan Mickey or Mitchie or whatever it is. But there's another very prominent, very left-wing person high in the councils of government, Munira Mirza, who's one of Mr. Johnson's closest advisors. And people should understand more and more. Maynard Keynes, the great economist, said long ago that if ever any politician said he didn't have any ideology, he was invariably the slave of some defunct economist. Politicians are often influenced by ideas they barely know or understand. The government that we have now is much more ideological than it itself understands. Is making much more radical changes to the country than it itself understands, and as a result, it's wildly distant from the old form of parliamentary government we used to have, in which government tested 2 or 3 times a week in parliamentary debate and with serious opposition. It doesn't get. There is no proper parliamentary opposition. No. So whatever dissent is going to be is going to be elite dissent in the small stairways and back rooms of actual hands-on government. And I would much prefer our dissent to take place in our elected parliament than in these back rooms.
Yes, but your heart sinks, doesn't it? I mean, I was listening.
When all power is concentrated in the government, and there is so little opposition, then of course all there's going to be is squabbling about who has power over what, and also the personal squabbling of the kind which we see. It's a symptom, I think, of a decay of what was formerly rather an effective parliamentary democracy.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I was listening last night as I was driving back up to London to a radio show in which they said, "Oh yes, the Labour Party will be asking for an urgent question to be tabled about the the furnishings of the Prime Minister's flat above 11 Downing Street." And I just thought, well, it matters not, because the question may well be granted, it may well be put, but it won't be answered, and then we'll move on.
Yes, but also, how is one supposed to identify with anybody in a stroll between Carrie Symonds and Dominic Cummings? I don't wish to take sides in that sort of battle, if that's a battle which is taking place. It doesn't interest me. I'm interested in how the country is run, how the schools are run, how what help we give to the married family, what our foreign policy is, whether we defend ourselves properly. These are things which interest me. None of them will be solved by worrying about whether somebody called Lulu has decorated the Prime Minister's sofa correctly.
That's true. However, unfortunately, the 2 people who have most recently run the government have been both Dominic Cummings and Carrie Symonds. Well, I guess that answers your question. Peter, thank you very much indeed.